June 6, 1944. Above Normandy's Bocage, France. A formation of P-47 Thunderbolts dives through gray dawn, their wing racks bristling with rockets and 500 lb bombs. German infantrymen below, expecting strafing fire, instead face explosions that shatter hedgerows into fire and dirt. June 1942, Bradley Field, Connecticut. The roar of a Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine shook the ground and rattled the enamel off mess kits in the training camp below. Cadets who had never seen combat yet instinctively flinched, as if the Jugs' thunder alone carried the violence of war. Above them, a silver-bellied fighter climbed ponderously into humid sky. Not the sleek Spitfire silhouette that graced posters, but a hulking brute with a belly like a barrel. The Republic P-47 had been born not from elegance, but from necessity. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian émigré chief designer at Republic Aviation, had been told in 1940 that the Army Air Forces needed an interceptor capable of fighting at 30,000 feet or higher. The Germans were pushing their Bf-19s ever faster. The Japanese Zero had already humbled Allied pilots in the Pacific. Kartveli's memos to Washington, now preserved in the Republic Company files, spelled out the trade-offs. Bigger engine, heavier frame, thicker armor. Performance would come from raw horsepower, not grace. That engine was the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders arranged in two massive rows, generating roughly 2,000 horsepower. It made the Jug one of the largest single-engine fighters of the war. Empty, it weighed about 5 tons, nearly double a Spitfire's weight, and almost 9 tons fully loaded. Its wings stretched 40 feet, broad enough to carry both 850 caliber Browning machine guns and thousands of pounds of bombs. Top speed approached 425 miles per hour, with a service ceiling of about 43,000 feet. When the first prototypes were rolled out at Republic's Farmingdale, New York factory, the reaction among some pilots was dismay. "It's a tractor with wings," wrote young cadet Quinton C. Anenson in a diary later published after the war. The line carried both affection and unease, a recognition that this machine felt agricultural, almost too big to fly with precision. Even General Henry Hap Arnold, who had pushed for larger, longer-range fighters, admitted privately to colleagues at Wright Field that the P-47 looked like an elephant compared to the trim Bf-109. Yet Arnold insisted the Jug would fill a role that slim-bodied fighters could not. Its sheer bulk meant it could dive faster than anything in the Luftwaffe inventory, its thick skin could absorb punishment, and its cavernous fuselage could house fuel for escort missions over Europe. At Wright Field in Ohio, test pilot Bob Samuelson proved the point during early trials, deliberately over-boosting the engine and hurling the fighter into power dives. Where a Spitfire would risk tearing itself apart, the P-47 stayed rock-steady, airframe groaning but intact. Back at Farmingdale, immigrant workers kept the assembly lines running around the clock. Polish machinists, Italian welders, and women hired fresh from Long Island schools labored under harsh fluorescent light. Lunchrooms were filled with tin lunch pails, pickles, and homemade sandwiches. They were producing what looked like a brute, and yet that brute would soon give American pilots something the Luftwaffe could not take away: survivability. The irony was thick. Dismissed as clumsy and too heavy to fight, the Jug would prove indestructible in the hands of its farm boy pilots. Luftwaffe commanders accustomed to dueling nimble Spitfires and Mustangs would find themselves battling a flying fortress that refused to die. And the name, Jug, stuck early. Some post-war writers tried to romanticize it as shorthand for juggernaut. In reality, pilots laughed. That its barrel-like fuselage resembled nothing more exotic than a milk jug. The farmer's nickname was the truest one. This was America's milk pail fighter. Plain and homely, built not for style, but for crushing endurance. What began as a tractor in the sky was about to become the hammer of the European battlefield. April 1943. Horsham St. Faith, England. Engines coughed in the drizzle as ground crews yanked starter carts away from the new Thunderbolts. Radios hissed with static, then went dead in several cockpits. Still, the men of the 56th Fighter Group lifted their heavy machines into rain-streaked skies, the first American P-47 unit to face the Luftwaffe. From the start, the Jug felt awkward in European combat conditions. Summarized reports from 8th Fighter Command note chronic radio failures on early sorties. Pilots unable to coordinate once they climbed into cloud. The climb itself was a burden. The P-47 needed almost 20 minutes to reach 25,000 feet, leaving many men sweating behind oxygen masks while German fighters already circled high above. With only about 200 miles of combat radius in early models, missions barely pushed past the French coast, until external tanks extended their reach later in 1943. At the helm was Cole Hubert Hub Zemke, a blunt-talking leader who understood morale mattered as much as horsepower. He forged his wolfpack through constant drilling, demanding tight formations and disciplined gunnery. Among his pilots were Francis Gabby Gabreski, destined to become America's leading ace in the European theater, and Robert S. Johnson, a farm boy from Arkansas whose quiet grit masked a stubborn survival instinct. The Luftwaffe unit that met them over France was Jagdgeschwader 26, the Abbeville Boys, veterans flying Messerschmitt Beef-19Gs and Focke-Wulf 190s. German fighters could turn inside the Jug with ease. In knife fights, the P-47 looked every bit the clumsy tractor critics had feared. Yet the Thunderbolt had a trick that few Germans anticipated: sheer durability and unmatched diving speed. Pilots quickly learned that rolling inverted and shoving the stick forward sent the Jug into a near-virginal escape, the airframe moaning but never breaking apart. Pursuers often dared not follow. The first confirmed P-47 kill came on April 15, 1943. A Jug pilot caught a Luftwaffe intruder head-on, its guns spitting, and squeezed the trigger on 8.50 caliber Brownings. German reports later listed a fighter lost over the Channel that day. It was a modest beginning, but it silenced skeptics who muttered that the Jug would never draw blood. Robert Johnson would become the embodiment of the P-47's legend. In a June 1943 sortie, his Jug was riddled by cannon fire from a Forth 190. He later recounted in a post-war memoir that more than 20 shells tore through the fuselage, shredding canopy and instruments. Trapped by a jammed cockpit hatch, he expected to die. Instead, the battered aircraft held together, engines still coughing out power. Johnson limped home, landing at Manston with a machine that looked more sieve than airplane. The irony was becoming evident. A fighter scorned as too heavy and too slow in the climb could shrug off punishment that would shatter a Spitfire. German pilots began to mutter about the Ierne Flugzeug vulga iron airplane. Even Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland would later remark in his memoirs that the Jug was difficult to shoot down. For Zemke, victories were always shadowed by losses. After-action reports counted both the claims and the men who failed to return. He took on the grim duty of writing condolence letters to families back home, explaining how their sons had died in the skies over France. "It weighs heavier than any sortie," he confessed to a colleague. Claims themselves were slippery. A pilot swore he had downed 2 FW-190s in flames, but post-war research revealed only 1 German aircraft lost in that sector. The fog of combat inflated Allied tallies, a reminder that numbers in war often served morale more than accuracy. By autumn 1943, the Jug had established itself as a paradox. Outclimbed and outturned, yet unbeatable in a dive, ungainly to look at, yet rugged beyond belief. For the young Americans of the 56th Fighter Group, the baptism had been bloody, but their machine had shown its worth. What had begun as doubt was turning into hard-earned respect, both from those who flew it and from the enemy forced to fight against it. Late 1943, East Anglia, England. By winter, American tactical commands had begun loading bombs onto hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts. The milk jug fighter, once built for high-altitude duels, was now routinely lumbering into the air with up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance slung beneath its wings. The doctrine shift came from necessity. The 8th Air Force's daylight bomber offensive bled heavily under German flak and fighters. Long-range escort still mattered, but 9th Air Force commanders saw another opportunity. Use the Jug as a hammer against German supply lines, bridges, and armor. In October 1943, directives summarized in 9th AF and IX Tactical Air Command orders authorized full fighter-bomber loadouts. The heavy frame, once mocked as a liability, suddenly became an advantage. General Elwood Pete Quesada, a fierce advocate of tactical air power, pressed the change through. He argued that the P-47's toughness made it ideal for low-level strikes, where return fire was fiercest. If it comes back with holes and the pilot alive, he told colleagues at 9th AF, that's the airplane we need. He had allies in the field. Colonel Dave Schilling, the aggressive leader of the 56th Fighter Group, who proved that Thunderbolts could deliver bombs with accuracy, and Major Benjamin Chidlaw, an operations officer who streamlined procedures for close support missions. The numbers told the story. A single P-47 could haul 2 500-pound bombs under the wings, plus up to 10 5-inch HVAR rockets, usually 8 in practice. In practice, accuracy for a dive-bombing run ran a circular error probable of 300 to 500 feet. Not enough to pick off a tank with certainty, but devastating against rail yards, bridges, and supply dumps. Pilots practiced skip bombing, trucks loosing ordnance so low that the blast often caught their own tails. Ground crews at RAF Buxted injected humor into the danger. Mechanics chalked cartoons and graffiti on bomb noses, Bugs Bunny swinging a hammer, or inscriptions like Berlin Express and Adolf's Present. The men laughed as they hoisted the ordnance, but knew half of those planes would return, riddled with flak holes. Irony defined the Jug's transformation. Designed as a high-altitude interceptor, it was now the closest thing to a tank buster in American service. The Royal Air Force already had the Typhoon dedicated to the anti-armor role. The U.S. Army Air Forces had stumbled into their own equivalent. But in a machine scorned just months earlier as clumsy and overbuilt, pilots soon realized the human dimension of their missions. In Normandy villages, children ran out after strikes to greet flyers who landed on temporary strips. They offered eggs, cider, and bread in exchange for chewing gum or candy. For farm boy pilots, it felt like stepping back into the world they had left behind in Iowa or Arkansas. Yet the juxtaposition was stark. Moments earlier, their bombs had shattered convoys or leveled rail defeats within earshot of those same villagers. The flying tank moniker gained traction in the press, and there was truth in it. The Jug's air-cooled radial engine and armored cockpit meant many pilots survived hits that would have destroyed lighter machines. Robert Johnson's earlier ordeal, limping home after dozens of cannon strikes, became a template. Still, survivability was not invincibility. Post-war studies revealed that roughly half of Thunderbolt combat losses in ground attack missions came from German 20mm and 37mm flak guns. Survivability improved odds, but did not guarantee a safe return. German records captured later confirmed the impact. Reports from Panzer Lehr Division in France complained that daylight convoys were forced to halt by constant Jabot attacks, short for Jagbomber, the German term for fighter bombers. Drivers camouflaged trucks under trees, moving only at night. Tank crews dreaded moving without overhead cover. To them, the Jug was not a clumsy tractor, it was a relentless hawk circling the road. The shift was psychological as well as tactical. American pilots had entered the war imagining themselves as knights of the air, dueling Messerschmitts at high altitude. Now they were learning to fly at treetop level, dodging telephone wires, strafing columns, and watching tracers stitch upward from every hedgerow. The glamorous air duel had been replaced by a brutal, grinding war of attrition. And yet the Jug thrived in this role. It could dish out punishment, soak up return fire, and still deliver its loads. What began as an interceptor had, by late 1943, become the thunderous hammer of tactical air power. For the ground troops who would soon cross into France, the thunder overhead meant survival. For the Germans, it meant paralysis. June 1944. Normandy, France. The only thing that terrifies our men more than artillery is the Thunderbolt. The line appeared in a paraphrased summary of a captured German officer's report, filed in June 1944. It was not exaggeration. To men pinned among the bocage, the low growl of a P-47 meant death striking from above. From D-Day onward, 9th Air Force and IX Tactical Air Command turned the Jug into a hammer against German lines. Their after-action summaries record staggering numbers. IX Tactical Air Command alone flew more than 31,000 sorties in June and July 1944, with individual groups often flying hundreds of close support missions in a week. A single day might see the 365th Fighter Group, the Hellhawks, launch over 100 attack runs, ranging from bridge strikes to armed reconnaissance, which meant hunting trucks and tanks along every road within range of Normandy. Brigadier General Elwood P. Quesada coordinated this symphony of thunder, tying air units directly to advancing ground forces. His innovation was constant radio contact between forward controllers and orbiting fighter bombers, a crude but effective ancestor of modern close air support. Pilots, trained to dive within a stone's throw of American lines, trusting ground troops to mark safe targets with smoke. The result was chaotic, violent, and devastating to German attempts at organized defense. For the Germans, the contrast was cruel. Their Tiger tanks, with 100 millimeters of frontal armor, could duel American Shermans on the open field. But Tigers required fuel, ammunition, and supply convoys. Thunderbolts shredded the soft underbelly of logistics. Trucks hidden under orchards, fuel dumps camouflaged with hay, even locomotives steaming in rail yards, all became targets. German diaries later revealed that entire convoys halted at the first sign of Yabos overhead. The fear of being spotted in daylight turned the Tiger from predator into stranded beast. Colonel Steve Pisanos, a Greek immigrant who had earned his wings in the Royal Air Force before joining the U.S. Army Air Forces, flew with the Hellhawks in these weeks. On one mission, flak tore through his wing, riddling the Jug until smoke trailed behind him. He managed to nurse the crippled machine to a makeshift strip near Carentan. As he climbed down, French villagers crowded the field. They waved, cheered, and pressed cider into his hands, grateful not only that he had survived, but that the Thunderbolts kept the German convoys away from their villages. The irony was striking. German armored divisions had been designed for decisive clashes with Allied tanks. Yet in the hedgerows, their greatest enemy was not the Sherman, but the P-47 roaring above. Air interdiction pinned down the armor that was supposed to break the American beachhead. Still, the price was heavy. IX TAC reports listed hundreds of fighter-bomber losses during the Normandy campaign, many to concentrated 20 mm and 37 mm flak batteries hidden in hedgerows or mounted on half-tracks. Pilots joked grimly that every French field seemed to sprout a flak gun. Survivors spoke of cockpits filled with smoke, wings shredded but still holding, the Jug somehow bringing them back across the channel or down onto Allied grass strip. Not every sight was triumphant. One detachment of pilots, walking back from their briefing tents, came upon American medics tending to wounded French children in a bombed-out village. Some of the injuries were from German fire, others from Allied airstrikes that had missed their mark. The image haunted the flyers. In their diaries, men confessed to a sense of moral whiplash, liberators one moment, bringers of fire the next. Meanwhile, Rommel himself tasted the reach of Allied air. On 17 July, his staff car was strafed by RAF fighters as it drove near Livarot. The field marshal was badly wounded, his skull fractured. Though not by a thunderbolt, the symbolism was clear. German command could not move freely in daylight. Even the most senior officers were prey to Allied air supremacy. The myths grew alongside the facts. Ground troops whispered that P-47 rockets could flip Tigers onto their backs. In reality, the 5-inch HVAR rarely destroyed heavy armor outright. Operational Research Section studies after the war showed that most kills attributed to rockets were in fact against lighter vehicles or immobilized tanks finished off by artillery. Yet the legends persisted, because fear magnified effect. To the German soldier crouching in a hedgerow, the distinction between myth and reality mattered little. Either way, the Jabos owned the sky. Enemy accounts confirmed the panic. One Wehrmacht diary, captured near Avranches during Operation Cobra, noted, "Road cut again, men refused to march until nightfall. Convoys scattered, thunderbolts return again and again." The paralysis was exactly what Wayland and Quesada sought. Not merely destruction, but the denial of movement. Normandy was hedgerow hell for infantry on both sides. For the Germans, it was made worse by the constant roar of Pratt and Whitney engines. For the Americans, the Jug became a grim comfort. A reminder that though the bocage slowed their advance, the skies belonged to them. And when Operation Cobra finally broke the German line at the end of July, the Thunderbolt had been there at every step, hammering bridges, torching convoys, and proving once more that the tractor-like fighter was the deadliest tool of liberation. December 17, 1944. Ardennes Forest. Snow fell thick across the pines, muting the forest into stillness. Then, the silence cracked apart. The staccato of .50 caliber fire echoed through the valleys as P-47s skimmed over treetops, their bullets carving dark lines across white snow. The Battle of the Bulge had begun in secrecy. On December 16th, German artillery and infantry crashed into American lines, catching entire divisions off guard. Under the overcast skies of Belgium and Luxembourg, Allied aircraft sat grounded. For days, American units fought alone, retreating through the snow without the comfort of their ever-present Jabos overhead. Brigadier General Elwood P. Quesada, commander of IX Tactical Air Command, seethed in his Ardennes command post. He had built his doctrine on close air support, on the partnership between ground troops and Thunderbolts orbiting above. Now the fog and snow strangled that alliance. Mission logs for December 1722 show little more than reconnaissance sorties, their pilots frustrated by cloud cover and icing wings. German panzer columns rolled unchecked, pushing toward the Meuse. Then came December 23. The skies cleared. In Quesada's words, the curtain lifted. USAAF mission logs show that IX and XIX tactical air commands together flew hundreds of direct support missions that day. Across the 9th Air Force, thousands more sorties followed in a 4-day wave. Fighter bombers clawed into the sky at first light, striking German armor, fuel depots, and supply lines. One of the pilots diving into the chaos was Lieutenant Colonel Dave Tex Hill, a veteran of the Flying Tigers in China, now flying Thunderbolts over Belgium. Hill led his squadron of the 362nd Fighter Group into columns of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, their black-crossed vehicles strung out along snowbound roads. Rockets and bombs turned frozen fields into firestorms. Hill later recalled seeing convoys scatter like ants in boiling water. The numbers were staggering. By Allied claims, more than 500 German tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed from the air during the Bulge. Post-war Operational Research Section studies cut that figure down to closer to 200, still devastating, but less than wartime reports suggested. What mattered, however, was not only destruction, but paralysis. German reliance on convoys, fuel trucks, horse-drawn wagons, supply trains, made them vulnerable. Thunderbolts and typhoons burned hundreds of these lifelines, forcing tanks to grind to a halt in snowdrifts for lack of fuel. One Jug pilot described strafing a road packed with wagons, then pulling up as he realized one cart carried wounded Germans. He rocked his wings and waved them on. In a war of fire and attrition, small gestures of mercy flickered like sparks in the dark. The irony was cruel for the Germans. Their offensive had been built on deception and surprise, launched under a shroud of fog to blind Allied air power. But secrecy depended on weather, and when the skies cleared, the same bold gamble collapsed. The Allied command wasted no time. Thousands of sorties hammered roads, bridges, and columns every daylight hour, flipping the balance in days. The devastation was not limited to tanks. Ardennes villages lit up in flames as convoys burned. Belgian civilians were trapped in the crossfire, their homes shattered by the same rockets that incinerated German supply lines. Thunderbolt pilots flying back over the lines could see plumes of fire stretching from one valley to the next, a grim patchwork of survival and loss. Yet the P-47 was not the only hand on the battlefield's lever. Even with skies cleared, the infantry of the 101st Airborne clung to Bastogne. Armored units blocked German thrusts long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Air power proved decisive in cutting fuel and slowing the advance, but the Bulge was a joint victory. Myth and memory sometimes turned it into an air victory, but the truth lay in combined arms, steel, mud, and thunder together. German reports captured afterward admitted the futility. One officer noted, "The skies are unflyable for us, dominated by Thunderbolts." Luftwaffe units, short of fuel and pilots, barely challenged the air on those clear days. For German infantry and tankers, the return of the Jabos meant no daylight march, no chance to move unmolested. By the end of December, the offensive had bled out in fire and snow. American GIs huddled in foxholes heard the roar of thunderbolts overhead and felt the tide turning. German tankers, staring at fuel gauges and watching convoys burn, understood their gamble was lost. The Battle of the Bulge would remain the bloodiest U.S. battle of the war, but its turning point belonged to the sky. The Jug, once dismissed as too heavy to matter, had again proved that weight could be strength. Snow had muffled the forests. Fire had ended the silence. January 1945. Western Front. When they appear, every man dies for the ditch. The line came from a German infantryman's letter, paraphrased in an intercepted intelligence brief. It summed up a truth that statistics alone could not capture. By 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt was as much a weapon of fear as of destruction. Allied surveys after the war estimated that 50 to 60% of German vehicle losses during retreats were caused by air interdiction strikes. Trucks burned on roads, trains derailed in forests, convoys scattered into ditches. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The rest lay in psychology, in the way Wehrmacht soldiers froze at the sound of a radial engine overhead. IX Tactical Air Command had perfected the art. Jugs swept along highways at treetop height, sometimes without firing a shot. Captured POWs later admitted they often abandoned trucks or wagons at the first glimpse of silver wings, convinced they were already doomed. The fear itself became a weapon, denying the Germans the ability to move in daylight. For Francis Gabreski, the celebrated ace who had spent 1943 and 1944 chasing Luftwaffe fighters, the shift to ground attack was jarring. He had built his reputation on duels at altitude, yet by 1945 his squadron often flew low-level sweeps, their targets not Messerschmitts, but fuel convoys. The ace who once counted kills now counted bridges destroyed. Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory of the RAF, watching the tactical war unfold, recognized the transformation. Air power no longer served simply to contest the skies. It had become an omnipresent shadow on the battlefield. German General Heinz Guderian, architect of the Blitzkrieg, wrote bitterly that Allied air had turned mobile warfare on its head. Our movements, once swift and decisive, are now broken by fire from above." The irony was sharp. Just 5 years earlier, the Luftwaffe had terrorized Europe, Stukas screaming over Poland, Messerschmitts sweeping the skies of France. Now it was German infantrymen who lived in dread, diving into ditches at the whisper of American or British fighters. Not all of that dread belonged to the Thunderbolt alone. RAF Typhoons carried rockets that shredded armored vehicles, Mustangs strafed trains with equal ferocity. But the Jugs' sheer numbers, rugged design, and relentless presence gave it a special place in the German imagination. It was the aircraft they saw most often, the one that kept coming back, no matter how many flak bursts pockmarked its wings. There were moments when the psychological war cut both ways. A P-47 pilot who strafed a German-held town recounted circling back later to see children emerge from cellars. Guilt gnawed at him. And yet, when his ground crew found him handing chocolate bars to those same children hours later, they saw the contradiction plainly. He could bring fire in the morning and kindness in the afternoon. By 1945, the Thunderbolt had become more than an aircraft. It was a sound in the sky that meant paralysis for the enemy and reassurance for the Allies. Fear had once been the Luftwaffe's weapon. Now it was America's farm-built Jug that cast the longer shadow. May 8, 1945. Europe. By VE Day, U.S. factories had built about 15,700 P-47 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter of the war. It was an astonishing figure, testimony to a machine that had grown from a scorned prototype into one of the most indispensable weapons in the Allied arsenal. The records tell the scale. According to the Army Air Force's Statistical Digest, P-47s flew more than 500,000 sorties across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. They dropped over 80,000 tons of bombs, destroyed thousands of vehicles and locomotives, and were credited with about 3,750 air-to-air victories. Roughly 3,500 Thunderbolts were lost in combat, but the sheer weight of sorties flown showed how deeply the Jug had been integrated into Allied operations. No other U.S. fighter carried quite the same dual role: high-altitude escort early on, ground attack hammer by war's end. Republic Aviation's plant in Farmingdale had made it possible. Around the clock, shifts of machinists, welders, and wind inspectors pushed airframes down the line. Designer Alexander Kartvelli walked the factory floor with charts under his arm, already dreaming of new machines. After the war, he would take lessons learned from the Jug and design the supersonic F-15 Thunder Chief, another bruiser of an aircraft. General Elwood Peak Quesada also carried his lessons forward. His insistence on radio-echoed forward air controllers and on embedding air power directly with ground armies became the blueprint for NATO's Cold War doctrine. In the skies of France and Belgium, he had tested a new way of fighting. In the halls of Washington, and later NATO commands, he codified it into policy. For pilots, the Jug's legacy was more personal. Robert S. Johnson, one of the 56th Fighter Group's top aces, toured schools after the war. Children asked about his kills, about the German fighters he had faced. He smiled and always circled back to the same point. The Jug carried me home more times than I deserved. It was not victory claims he remembered most, but survivability, the fact that the heavy fighter brought him back alive. Compared to its British cousin, the RAF Typhoon, the Jug was less specialized. Typhoons excelled at killing tanks with rockets, carving columns apart in Normandy. The Thunderbolt's genius was in all-around endurance, air-to-air when needed, bombing and strafing by the tens of thousands of sorties, and above all, keeping pilots alive through punishment. Survivability was its own form of lethality, because it meant pilots could fight again tomorrow. Ground troops knew this better than anyone. Infantry pinned under fire often called P-47s their guardian angels. The Jug might not have been pretty, but the scream of its dive and the thunder of its bombs meant survival for men in foxholes. Soldiers joked that the Germans had Tigers, but America had Jugs. And the Jugs were everywhere. Decades later, veterans returned to the French villages they had once strafed or defended. Pilots who had tossed chocolate bars from cockpits in 1944 found now elderly men and women who still remembered the gesture. Liberation had come in many forms, sometimes fire, sometimes kindness. The Jug had carried both. The irony was complete. Born as an ungainly, overweight fighter that many dismissed as a failed design, the P-47 had ended the war as a symbol of power, durability, and persistence. It never single-handedly won a battle, but it multiplied Allied momentum and sowed constant fear among German troops. By the time peace returned, the Jug's reputation was secure. It was the farm boy's fighter, the flying tank, the milk jug turned angel of thunder. In its shadow, the Luftwaffe collapsed, German armies stalled, and Allied soldiers moved forward under a sky they finally owned.